The millionaire was about to sign a $200 million contract when his fury exploded. No one there spoke German. The silence was suffocating. Until the maid, invisible to everyone, raised her voice and revealed a truth that would change everything. Millionaire Victor Blackwell's penthouse was a monument to power, perched high above Chicago, where glass reflected the sky and Italian marble transformed the floor into a cold mirror. There, each painting cost enough to buy entire houses, and each piece of furniture was more sculpture than seating. That Sunday, the air felt heavier, as if sensing something was about to collapse. Ruth Morgan walked the halls in her blue uniform and yellow gloves, carrying a tray of polished glasses that gleamed under the artificial lights. Invisible as always, she avoided eye contact, accustomed to being ignored. But behind that humble countenance, there was a flame no one recognized. Her military uncle, Thomas Morgan, had left her an unusual legacy, a command of German and lessons of honor that she carried in her heart. Ruth never imagined that night, this silent knowledge would confront an empire and transform her life forever. Victor Blackwell stood before the central table, a massive piece of dark wood bearing a contract bound in brown leather, heavy and imposing. Beside him, his brother Richard Blackwell stood with his arms crossed, his expression cold and calculating, as if observing the board of a game he already believed he had won. The sum on the table was enormous, $200 million in investments and equity, a deal that promised to double the reach of the Blackwell empire. There was just one detail. The contract was also written in German, the language of the powerful foreign company they intended to acquire. The hired interpreter seemed increasingly uncomfortable, shifting in his chair as if the words he had to say weighed tons. The tension was so palpable that even the clink of the crystal glasses on Ruth's tray sounded like thunder in the immensity of that charged silence. It was in this atmosphere that the guest of honor, Friedrich Adler, CEO of Adler International Holdings, entered the room, wearing an impeccable gray suit, with a firm gaze and a posture that exuded serenity. He seemed to carry centuries of European tradition on his shoulders. His handshake was restrained but conveyed a confidence that contrasted with Victor's uneasiness, whose forced smile almost hid his impatience. Ruth, in the background, watched discreetly as she poured the first glasses of champagne. The German seemed to measure every gesture, every word translated by the interpreter, who stuttered under the pressure. It was at that moment that Victor lost his composure. He slammed his hand down hard on the table, making the contract tremble and echoing like thunder through the penthouse. "Does anyone here speak German?" he roared. The silence that followed was suffocating, and it was in this vacuum of fear and disbelief that Ruth realized her destiny was about to change forever. The silence after Victor Blackwell's roar was like a void that devoured every sound in the penthouse. The executives glanced at each other uncomfortably, but none dared speak. The hired interpreter wiped the sweat from his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief, unable to meet the millionaire's gaze. Richard, the younger brother, leaned forward slightly in his leather chair, his eyes full of contempt, as if anticipating the coming explosion. Friedrich Adler remained calm, observing the scene with an almost cruel patience, as if testing not only the contract but also the men he was negotiating with. Ruth, still standing, almost pressed against the wall, gripped the tray so tightly that her fingers ached beneath her yellow gloves. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind. The value of a man lies in telling the truth, even when it costs dearly. She took a deep breath, as if about to plunge into icy water. Victor, increasingly irate, glared at those present like a cornered predator. $2 million spent on this deal, and no one can translate half a dozen lines into German? He shouted, spitting the words. His eyes scanned the room, waiting for someone to raise a hand, for someone to bolster his authority. But no one dared. Not the imported lawyers, not the Italian-suited directors, all so quick to applaud, now so cowardly in the face of their boss's fury. Friedrich Adler remained motionless, his clear eyes fixed on Victor, but there was something in his expression. A faint gleam of distrust, as if he already knew that this silence hid more than incompetence. Ruth, instinctively, approached the table to collect some empty glasses. It was at that moment that her eyes fell on the open page of the contract, and what she read made her heart race like a war drum. The German words leaped out at her, as familiar as the stories her Uncle Thomas told her on the nights he returned from the military base. Ruth had never imagined that this knowledge, cultivated in secret, could be of any value here, at the heart of an empire that had no sight of her. But now, the translation was too clear to ignore. A hidden clause stated that, in the event of market instability, all of Adler International's multimillion-dollar shares would be transferred to the full control of Blackwell Enterprises. It wasn't a detail. It was a calculated coup, a $200 million fraud disguised in legal flourishes. The blood drained from her face. Ruth almost dropped the tray, but took a deep breath, holding herself back. The decision was both impossible and inevitable. Speaking would mean risking her job and her mother's survival, but remaining silent would mean colluding with a lie that would destroy innocence. Her eyes lifted and met, for a moment, Friedrich Adler's steady gaze. Victor Blackwell noticed the maid's subtle movement and narrowed his eyes like a hawk about to swoop down on its prey. "What are you looking at, Ruth?" His voice boomed, thick with venom. The executives raised their heads curiously, the thin air in the room seeming to tighten even more. Richard Blackwell crossed his arms, a sneer playing on his lips, as if awaiting the spectacle of imminent humiliation. Ruth felt her heart pound in her throat, each pulse echoing in her ears like a drum. She knew if she spoke, she would cross a line of no return. But the words already burned in her throat, as if her conscience could not bear the weight of silence. The contract, gleaming in the golden light of the chandelier, seemed to scream the truth no one dared see. Her world could end in seconds, but her uncle's voice echoed again. "Honor, Ruth, is the only wealth that can never be stolen." She took a deep breath and, still holding the tray, replied in a firm but controlled tone. "It says something else, sir." The room froze. The interpreter's eyes widened, unable to react. Friedrich Adler leaned forward slightly, interested for the first time in this suffocating meeting. Victor laughed, a harsh, mocking laugh that reverberated against the glass walls. "It says something else? You?" he mocked, walking until he was a few feet away from Ruth. "You're just the cleaning lady. What right do you have to interrupt a $1 million negotiation with your fantasies?" The dry sound of his voice reverberated like whips. Richard chuckled, adding even more tension to the air. But Ruth didn't look away. Behind the fear, there was a spark of courage that Friedrich immediately grasped, his narrow eyes shining as if testing the truth she held. "Then translate," Victor challenged, his voice deep and dangerous, like a verdict. Ruth swallowed, dropped the tray on the side table, and slowly approached the contract. Her yellow gloves touched the paper lightly, but her eyes were fixed on the malicious clause. With a clear, precise tone, and without hesitation, she read in German, each word resounding like a hammer against the silence. Then she translated into English for everyone. In the event of a fluctuation of more than 5% in the regional market, all $1 million shares of Adler International will be transferred to the administrative control of Blackwell Enterprises. The words fell like grenades. A deathly silence fell over the penthouse. Friedrich raised his eyebrows, his lips curling almost imperceptibly in recognition. Victor, however, stood still, his face flushed with anger, but without immediate rebuttal. And in that instant, Ruth knew there was no turning back. She had exposed the truth before everyone. The interpreter, a man in a light-colored suit with sweaty hands, began to tremble visibly as Friedrich Adler slowly turned toward him. The German's eyes were cold as steel, piercing him unhurriedly but with an almost unbearable force. "Translate exactly what she said," he ordered in impeccable German. The silence was so absolute that even the distant ticking of a Swiss clock on the wall sounded like a thunderclap. The interpreter cleared his throat, his voice breaking as he hesitantly repeated Ruth's revealing translation in English. All eyes fell on him. Victor Blackwell walked toward the man like a predator, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Are you telling me you allowed a cleaning lady to interpret the contract better than you?" He spat, each word poisoned with hatred. The interpreter tried to explain himself, but sweat beaded on his forehead, betraying that there was something else hidden within his conscience. Richard Blackwell clapped his hands slowly, his low laugh cutting through the silence like a blade. Well, so that's it? The maid with magical linguist powers saving us from a German conspiracy? What cheap theater." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but his fidgeting hands betrayed nervousness. Ruth, her heart racing, kept her eyes on the interpreter. She recognized that hesitant look, the same one she'd seen so often in her military uncle when he spoke of men carrying secrets too heavy to bear. Friedrich leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the glass table, and spoke in English, this time to everyone. "I want this man to explain now in front of everyone why that clause was unclear." The interpreter swallowed, his eyes pleading for a way out that didn't exist. The thin air in the room seemed to press down on his shoulders like tons of concrete. Finally, the dam broke. The interpreter stammered, his eyes fixed on the floor, his voice so low it was barely audible. I received extra compensation." The murmur rippled through the room like electricity. $20,000. He confessed, louder now, his voice cracking with desperation. "They asked me to adjust the German translation. They said no one would pay attention, that you would trust the English version." Friedrich sat back slowly in his chair, his gaze filled with silent fury, while Ruth stood firm, her breath shallow but steady. Victor Blackwell exploded, his face purple with rage, shouting, "Liar! You ruined everything." But the weight of the confession had already descended upon the room like a verdict. Ruth felt the ground shift beneath her feet, that for the first time truth began to outweigh power. The silence that followed the interpreter's confession seemed almost solid, heavy as an invisible wall pressing down on everyone in the room. Richard Blackwell leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming the armrest with nervous impatience, trying to hide the tension throbbing in his temples. Victor, on the other hand, paced back and forth like a caged bull, snorting with rage, his eyes glaring at Ruth as if she were to blame for the entire disaster. Friedrich Adler, however, remained motionless, his expression impenetrable, though his dark eyes burned with a dangerous intensity. He rested his hands on the table, slowly interlaced his fingers, and in a deep, controlled voice, spoke in English for all to hear. "Fraud is not masked by fine words, and the truth, as we have just heard, did not come from men paid to speak, but from someone invisible to your eyes." His gaze fixed on Ruth, and for the first time, there was explicit recognition in his voice. Ruth felt her heart race, her gloved hands trembling slightly against the fabric of her blue uniform. Never in her life had someone of such prestige given her a voice in front of so many. She took a deep breath, trying to hold the moment, but the pressure was overwhelming. Men in suits watched her as if she were a puzzle, a piece out of place on the board. Richard laughed out loud, trying to regain control of the situation. With all due respect, Adler, are you going to tell me you trust a cleaning lady more than the translators on my team? His voice dripped with disdain, but Friedrich didn't back down. He leaned forward slightly, the shadow of a cold smile curving his lips. Trust can't be bought with money, Wentworth. She demonstrated something you don't have: courage and honor. The name sounded like a sharp blow, reverberating between the glass walls of the penthouse, and for the first time, the murmurs began to lean against the Blackwells. Victor exploded, slamming his palm on the table, making the crystal glasses clink dangerously. That's an insult. A cleaning lady has no authority to speak here. The contract is valid, period. The aggressive tone sounded like a cornered animal defending its territory, but Friedrich maintained his implacable calm. He stood slowly, straightening his jacket with calculated movements, and looked directly at Ruth, ignoring the shouts of the Millionaire brothers. "Mrs. Morgan," he said in German, his voice firm and clear, "I will read this document again, but only if you will accompany me." Ruth felt the room spin, wide eyes turning to her, some with contempt, others with curiosity. Her heart was pounding, but she nodded, every fiber of her being filled with a mixture of fear and a strange strength. In that moment, she wasn't just a maid. She was the key that could decide the fate of an empire. Friedrich Adler slowly pulled out the chair next to her, a gesture laden with meaning, as if drawing a line on the invisible floor separating honor from corruption. "Please, sit here, Frau Morgan," he said in German, his intonation respectful but firm, making it impossible for anyone to mistake it for condescension. Ruth hesitated for a moment, feeling the eyes burn against her skin like blades, but moved with measured steps to the chair, settling herself beside the man who now seemed a bastion of dignity amidst the chaos. The murmur of the executives present sounded like a restless swarm, some in disbelief, others already realizing they were witnessing a historic moment. Richard forced a dry laugh, leaning forward as if trying to ridicule the obvious. "Seriously, Adler? Are you going to turn this meeting into a circus show?" But no one laughed. The disapproving silence was more deafening than any laughter. Victor clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white, but he remained standing, breathing heavily, as if holding back a hurricane. Friedrich spread the contract on the table, smoothing the page with almost ritualistic care, and looked directly at Ruth. "Show me, please. Where is the fraud they tried to hide?" Ruth swallowed hard, her eyes scanning the printed lines with the familiarity of someone trained in the silence of the early morning. The memory of her uncle August Kruger flashed in her mind, the stern but fair soldier who had taught her German like one passing on a legacy. She pointed to the specific clause, her fingers trembling but steady. "Here, Herr Adler," she said in impeccable German. "This section doesn't speak of revaluation of positions as in English. It says here that Adler and Weiss shares would be transferred in full to Blackwell Global in the event of a 5% decline in the market." The entire room froze. Friedrich leaned in for a closer look, his eyes flashing like steel as he confirmed each word. He then sealed the contract with a sharp crack, so loud in the silence of the room that it made some executives flinch. "This is not a misunderstanding," he said quietly, but it carried a lethal weight. "This is a carefully engineered $200 million coup." The words fell like hammer blows, cracking the veneer of power the Blackwell brothers still held. Richard tried to fight back, raising his hands as if to erase the gravity of the accusation. "This is ridiculous, just technical language." But Friedrich drew himself up to his full height, his gaze fixed like a sentence. "It's ridiculous to believe that honor can be sold. And today, gentlemen, honor has been redeemed by the one you despise." He looked directly at Ruth, inclining his head in acknowledgement, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. The power game had shifted, and everyone knew it. Victor Blackwell slammed his fist on the table so hard that the crystal glasses shook, sending echoes that resounded like thunder in the glass-enclosed room. His face was flushed, the veins pulsing on his neck, his eyes blazing with hatred. "This is a farce," he roared, pointing an accusing finger at Ruth. "A maid has no right to interfere in multimillion-dollar deals. You're destroying something you don't understand." The attack was not just anger, but also desperation, as if he knew deep down that his sandcastle was crumbling. Richard, nearby, tried to maintain his composure, but his voice sounded weak, almost pleading. "Friedrich, listen to me. We can renegotiate. We can adjust the terms. Nothing needs to leave this room." But the silence that surrounded them no longer belonged to them. The weight of the revealed fraud had transformed the luxurious penthouse into an invisible courtroom, where every glance was a verdict against the brothers. Ruth, even with her heart pounding like war drums, rose from her chair, her simple blue uniform a stark contrast to the expensive suits around her. Her voice was firm, unwavering. "I understand more than you think, because it's not just about numbers, it's about dignity." The sentence fell through the air like a sharp blade, cutting through the atmosphere saturated with arrogance. Sophie Carter, the senior assistant who always stood in the shadow of the executives, couldn't help but gasp in admiration. "She's right," she murmured, low but audible enough to echo. Friedrich, sensing the opportunity, stepped forward. A fraud only thrives in silence. But today the silence has been broken, and it was broken by the one you despised. Eyes turned to Ruth, not as a servant, but as someone who had just become the centerpiece of a power game. Victor tried to regain ground, spreading cynicism. "Are you really going to believe her? A cleaning lady who barely knows her feet? This contract is worth $200 million. Who in their right mind would listen to someone like that?" But it was precisely this desperate attempt that sealed his defeat. Friedrich took a step forward, his shadow looming over the Blackwell brothers. "Exactly $200 million, Victor. And that's why your greed blinded you. You underestimated the wrong person. While you boasted, she watched. While you schemed, she learned. And while you lied, she told the truth." Ruth said nothing, but her erect posture, the steady gleam in her eyes, was answer enough. For the first time, the executives present began to lean discreetly away from the Blackwells, realizing who truly held the moral authority in the room. Friedrich Muller pushed his glasses up his nose, his expression grave as a judge about to deliver a sentence. The German walked slowly across the room, each step echoing like a gong, until he stopped before the table where the contract still lay open. He ran his fingers over the fraudulent clause, then looked directly at Victor and Richard. "Explain this," he said in a cold tone. It wasn't just a request, it was an order that brooked no escape. The air seemed denser, heavier, as if everyone present was having trouble breathing. Richard tried to speak, but his voice wavered, sounding like cracked glass. "Friedrich, there's been a misunderstanding." But the German raised his hand, cutting his words like a blade. "Don't you dare call this a misunderstanding. This is theft." The word fell like lead, sealing the Blackwell's humiliation. Ruth watched in silence, her yellow gloves still stained with dust from her work, but now carrying the dignity of someone who had exposed the truth. Her eyes met Sophie Carter's, who nodded discreetly, as if acknowledging that an irreversible change had just occurred. Friedrich continued, "You tried to exploit my team's trust, believing no one would notice. But you didn't count on someone who carries values stronger than any fortune. He then turned to Ruth. And these values don't come from universities or the private clubs you frequent, but from someone who has learned to see real life. Ruth felt her heart race, realizing he was talking about her. The entire room, previously indifferent, now seemed to revolve around the employee who had dared to break the silence. Victor, increasingly cornered, slammed his palm on the table. "She's nothing but a servant. You're all blind." But his voice, once so imposing, now sounded desperate, almost pathetic. Richard tried to soothe. "Perhaps we can amend the document, adjust terms," but no one seemed willing to listen. Friedrich leaned forward, staring intently at his brothers. "This isn't about adjusting terms. This is about principles. And principles, gentlemen, are non-negotiable." He turned his gaze to Ruth once more, as if inviting her to stand firm against the world that had always tried to erase her. The invisible force of that moment was overwhelming. The Blackwell Empire was beginning to crumble, not at the hands of tycoons, but by the simple voice of a woman who dared to reveal the truth. Friedrich Müller settled into the main chair, the silence so thick that the distant ticking of a wall clock could be heard. He then said, calmly but authoritatively, "I want to hear from her." All heads turned to Ruth, who still held the crumpled cleaning cloth in her hands. Her heart was pounding like a drum, but her posture remained firm. Sophie Carter, her eyes brimming with admiration, whispered, "You can do it." Ruth took a deep breath and, in a calm but clear voice, began to read in German the clause hidden in the contract. Each syllable, pronounced with impeccable precision, reverberated in the room. It was as if the foreign language, once an enigma to everyone, had become a blade cutting through the Blackwell's illusions. As Ruth read, Victor and Richard squirmed in their chairs, unable to hide their discomfort. Each word felt like a hammer demolishing the glass castle they had built. Ruth then translated into English, her voice cracking but firm. In the event of regional instability greater than 5%, all assets of Müller Industrien would be transferred in full to the administrative control of Blackwell Global. Shock coursed through the room like electricity. It was the written confession of the $200 million scam. Friedrich narrowed his eyes, and an indignant murmur ran through the executives present. Sophie clapped her hand over her mouth in disbelief. Ruth, however, simply signed the contract firmly, as if sealing an unappealable verdict. The German leaned forward, regarding Victor and Richard with icy coldness. "So, this is what you call a partnership?" His voice echoed like suppressed thunder, and no one dared interrupt. Ruth, still standing, seemed to hold in her hands not just a contract, but the fate of everyone in the room. Edward Langford, previously silent, rose and declared solemnly, "Gentlemen, this is not a misunderstanding, but an attempted fraud." The final blow had been struck. The audience, which had seemed indifferent until recently, now regarded Ruth not as a cleaning lady, but as the guardian of a truth that could save a fortune and destroy an empire. The weight of that moment was irreversible. Victor Blackwell stood abruptly, the chair creaking behind him like a scream of protest. Sweat dripped down his temple, but his voice was filled with venom. "This is ridiculous. We're listening to a cleaning lady. She has no training, no credentials, nothing but a mop in her hands." The attack echoed through the room, trying to turn Ruth's revelation into a mere illusion. Some executives looked away, uncomfortable, but Richard Hale seized the opportunity and added, "Exactly. It's a shameful scene. Letting a maid destroy the reputation of businessmen is insane." Ruth took a deep breath, her inner voice screaming at her not to shrink, not to surrender. She knew that more than a contract was at stake. The dignity of her entire life was at stake. Friedrich raised his hand, instantly silencing the chaos of accusations. The weight of his authority was so immense that even Victor fell silent. The German then turned to Ruth and said, with a calmness that cut like a blade, "I want to know about you. How did you learn to speak my language with such precision?" Ruth's heart raced. She felt everyone's gaze boring into her skin, waiting for an answer. In a trembling but confident voice, she said, "It was my uncle, Major Anthony Wallace. He fought in Europe. He taught me German not as a language, but as a value. He said that to understand another culture was to respect the heart of a people." The room fell into a reverent silence, the mention of military life awakening deep echoes in Friedrich's chest. The German millionaire's gaze narrowed, his breathing heavy. "Anthony Wallace," he repeated as if testing an old memory. Then his eyes welled with surprise. "Your uncle served at Nuremberg, didn't he?" Ruth nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Friedrich then revealed, his voice breaking, "My grandfather, Ernst Müller, was saved by a young American soldier, an officer who gave him water and prevented his execution. He always talked about him, but only knew Wallace by name." A collective gasp filled the room. The unexpected connection spanned generations. Ruth's uncle had saved Friedrich's grandfather. Now, decades later, she was the one saving the Müller family's honor and fortune. It was more than fate. It was justice. The weight of the revelation hung in the air like a sentence. Friedrich Müller, until then restrained and diplomatic, rose from his chair and walked slowly toward Ruth. Each step echoed on the marble, imposing an almost ritualistic solemnity. He looked her in the eye and said firmly, "It's no coincidence. Your family gave life to my grandfather. Today you gave life to my company." The room fell into absolute silence. Victor Blackwell, still standing, seemed to have lost half his strength as he realized the story was slipping out of his control. Ruth, her eyes brimming with tears, lowered her head in respect, but Friedrich gently lifted her chin. "We don't lower our heads today, Mrs. Morgan. Today, the world needs to see who truly brought the truth." At that moment, Richard Hale tried to react, slamming his hand on the table. "This is absurd. A war story, an old memory. None of this changes the fact that she's just an employee with no degree, no say in the matter of multimillion-dollar contracts." The words were venom, spit to poison Ruth's credibility. But before they could echo, Edward Langford stood up, his tone calm but charged with conviction. "Enough, Hale. I've already checked the pages. What Ruth pointed out is true. It's a criminal clause, hidden to hand over millions of the company's assets directly to Kruger and Stein Capital." Shocked murmurs spread around the table. Victor's protective mask shattered. His connection to the fraudulent clause was now too obvious to ignore. Friedrich raised his voice again, this time to everyone. The scam was worth $200 million, and it wasn't a lawyer or an executive who disarmed it. It was a woman the world insists on not seeing, but who carries within her the strength of honor. Eyes met, some in shame, others in disbelief. Sophie Carter, the senior assistant, muttered almost unconsciously, "She saved us." The impact was immediate. The other executives began to look at one another, aware they were witnessing something historic. Victor opened his mouth to protest, but his voice died at Friedrich's icy expression. "You tried to mislead my name and my history, Blackwell, but the one who will be marked will be you." The piercing silence that followed sealed his fate. Friedrich Müller took a deep breath, walking to the head of the table where the contract remained open, like an open wound. With a firm gesture, he closed the file and pushed it aside. The dry sound echoed through the room like a judge's gavel. "This agreement is closed," he declared, in English thick with a German accent. The sentence was final, incontestable. Ruth, still standing, didn't know whether to retreat or remain there. But her eyes met his, and for the first time she realized that it wasn't just gratitude that shone in his gaze, but also profound respect. Victor Blackwell stepped forward, sweating cold. Friedrich, don't be hasty. I can renegotiate, adjust terms. But his voice sounded pathetic, a distant shadow of the imposingness he had always carried. Renegotiate. Friedrich's voice turned to ice. You tried to steal Blackwell. You tried to tarnish a legacy of honor with your greed. And worse, you tried to intimidate and humiliate the one who brought the truth to light. The room's eyes fell on Ruth, who swallowed hard. Richard Hale tried to intervene, raising his hands as if he could erase the last few hours. We can't destroy years of partnership because of the word of a cleaning lady. The sentence fell like poison, but was immediately neutralized. Edward Langford stood and slammed his fist on the table. It's not the word of a cleaning lady, Hale. It's the truth. She proved it. And if you can't see that, perhaps you're too blind to continue sitting at this table. A murmur of approval ran through the group. Friedrich turned to Ruth, completely ignoring the Blackwells. You not only saved my company from a devastating blow, you restored my family's honor. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. And that's why, starting today, I no longer want to see you as a cleaning lady. I want to see you as someone who will have a place of trust within Muller Industries. The room gasped in collective shock. Sophie Carter clapped her hand to her mouth, overcome with emotion. Ruth felt her legs weaken, her heart racing uncontrollably. Never in her life had she heard something so improbable, so far from her reality. Victor Blackwell, for his part, staggered like a man who had just heard the final sentence of his downfall. Ruth Morgan stood still, as if her body had forgotten how to breathe. Friedrich's words echoed in her mind, but they seemed so unreal they almost sounded like a dream. A place of trust within Muller Industries. She repeated mentally, unable to believe it was directed at her. A woman in a blue uniform and yellow gloves, accustomed to being invisible in the corners of luxurious rooms. Mr. Muller, She tried to say something, but her voice was choked by the avalanche of emotions. Friedrich merely raised his hand for silence and firmly added, It's not charity, it's merit. You demonstrated intelligence, courage, and honor, qualities many here lost long ago. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but she remained direct. The executives exchanged uncertain glances. Charles Wentworth stroked his chin, visibly annoyed, while Richard Hale seemed about to protest again. But it was Patrick Collins who broke the silence, his voice thick with disbelief. You're really going to trust our company's reputation to a cleaning lady? Friedrich turned slowly toward him, his eyes hard as steel. I'd rather trust a cleaning lady who can read the truth in 2 languages and have the courage to expose it than analysts incapable of seeing fraud right in front of their noses. The room fell into a deathly silence. Sophie Carter was the first to react, clapping softly, a timid but meaningful gesture. Soon others followed, hesitant, but recognizing that a new order was being born there. Victor Blackwell looked like a ghost, his skin pale and his eyes glassy. The man who once dominated every negotiation now trembled in the face of inevitable ruin. You'll regret this, he murmured, barely audible, but no one paid attention. Friedrich approached Ruth, softening his expression just for her. I need people like that by my side. People who won't be bought, who won't bow to arrogance. Ruth lowered her head, overcome with emotion, but replied firmly, Mr. Mahler, I don't have a degree. I don't know how to handle millions of dollars. I only know how to work hard and honestly." He smiled, and for the first time his rigid features seemed human. "That's exactly what we need. The rest can be learned. Character, not." And in that moment, Ruth realized her life would never be the same again. The atmosphere on the penthouse floor was charged with tension, as if each word could shatter the air into shards. Ruth Morgan remained silent, her heart pounding, as she watched Victor Blackwell stagger to the leather armchair, sinking into it like a defeated man. Eleanor Blackwell, his wife, desperately tried to call someone on her cell phone, but the screen only displayed rejected calls. Her brother, Victor Jr., stood rigid, unable to meet the executive's gaze. That empire that had always prided itself on appearing invincible, shielded from criticism, was now crumbling before everyone's eyes. It was like watching a house of cards collapse with a single breath. Ruth felt not joy, but an immense weight of reality. She was witnessing the end of a dynasty that for years had crushed people like her. Friedrich Muller walked calmly to the table where the contract still lay open. With a serene yet authoritative gesture, he closed the leather folder and pushed it aside. "This document is invalid. This deal never existed," he declared firmly, as if signing an irrevocable sentence. Charles Wentworth looked away, ashamed, while Richard Hale slumped in silence, finally accepting that the fight was lost. Patrick Collins remained motionless, but in his eyes was a clear confession of defeat. Sophie Carter, on the other hand, looked proud, as if she had waited her entire life for this moment. The scene was historic, and at its center, a 30-year-old maid in a blue uniform and yellow gloves was the one responsible for turning the tide. Victor Blackwell desperately tried to stand once more. "Friedrich, we've always been allies. We can renegotiate. I'll pay double, triple. Just name the price." His voice sounded like a pitiful plea, devoid of dignity. Friedrich didn't respond immediately. He just looked him up and down, assessing this man who had once exuded arrogance and now begged for crumbs of respect. When he finally spoke, his voice was icy. "It's not about money, Victor. It's about honor. Something you've never known how to cultivate." A complete silence fell over everyone, and in that instant, Ruth realized that justice, however rare and late, had finally reached that luxurious ballroom. The room, once filled with loud voices, now echoed only with the muffled sound of everyone present breathing. Friedrich Muller approached Ruth Morgan, stopping before her with a gaze filled with respect and recognition. For the first time in her life, Ruth didn't feel invisible. Her hands still trembled, but there was a new strength in her chest, a strength that came not from her blue uniform, but from the courage of daring to speak the truth when everyone else had fallen silent. Friedrich bowed his head slightly before her, a gesture that made every executive hold their breath. "Frau Morgan," he said calmly, "it was your integrity that averted disaster and preserved my company. From this day forward, you will not be remembered as a mere employee, but as someone who carried the honor when all others failed." Charles Wentworth, still surprised, cleared his throat, trying to break the silence, but his voice faltered. Richard Hale, who had so doubted her, looked away in shame, unable to face the woman who had saved an empire from ruin. Sophie Carter, on the other hand, smiled discreetly, as if wanting to keep that scene in her memory forever. Friedrich then revealed what no one expected. "Ruth, I wish to offer you a position of trust in my corporation, not as charity, but in recognition of what you have demonstrated. We need people like that, steadfast, loyal, and incorruptible." The revelation fell like a bombshell in the room. Ruth, stunned, could hardly breathe. Such an offer was more than a dream. It was the opening of a door she had never imagined existed for someone like her. Helen's teary eyes were no longer filled with humiliation, but with disbelief. Ruth felt the weight of the words as a new calling, an opportunity to transform not only her life but also that of her family. She remembered her military uncle, Arthur Morgan, who always told her that honor is the most precious thing anyone can carry. It was as if those words echoed within her now, at the moment her life was changing forever. Friedrich extended his hand, and Ruth, hesitantly, took it. The gesture was simple, but it had the power of a pact. There, in the heart of the penthouse that had witnessed arrogance and humiliation, a new future was born for the woman who dared to speak out when no one else dared. Weeks later, Ruth Morgan's life was no longer the same. The long nights cleaning quiet hallways were gone, replaced by intense yet dignified days at Muller Industries headquarters. She now had a simple but respectable desk where she reviewed documents and followed up on reports. Her colleagues regarded her with a mixture of respect and admiration, many still incredulous at the extraordinary leap forward in her career. Friedrich Muller made a point of mentioning her in meetings, not to extol her excessively, but to let everyone know that the company was now valuing more than numbers. It was valuing integrity. Ruth felt that with each signature she reviewed, she was honoring Uncle Arthur's memory, as if each line she read were a silent tribute to the man who had given her courage. The change wasn't just professional, but also personal. With fair pay and the support Friedrich offered, Ruth was finally able to leave the cramped little room where she lived. She moved into a simple but peaceful house, with light walls, modest furniture, and a large window that let in the golden light of the late afternoon. It was a home where there was no longer any fear of demands, nor the weight of uncertainty crushing one's chest. In the small yard, Ruth planted yellow flowers, remembering the ones her uncle had tended in kindergarten. Each petal was like a symbol of rebirth, as if telling her that honor could still bloom even after so much suffering. For the first time in many years, Ruth truly felt at home. One quiet evening, she sat in the newly organized living room, a steaming cup of tea in hand. On the wall, in a simple frame, hung a photograph of Arthur Morgan in military uniform, his gaze steady and full of dignity. Ruth let out a soft smile and quietly thanked him. "Uncle, it was your voice that guided me, even after so many years. Today, I carry your honor with me." Outside, the moon illuminated the quiet street, and Ruth felt that the future, once so distant and hazy, now shone with concrete promise. She was no longer just an invisible maid. She was the woman who had foiled a $200 million scam, earned respect, and paved the way for a new chapter. And as she closed her eyes to rest, she knew her story didn't end there. It was just the beginning of something much greater. If this moving story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, like it, and activate the bell so you don't miss future inspiring stories. And comment below from where you're watching. Thank you so much for your support.